microphone is on also. uh, Turn on the old noise canceling. Sorry, folks, just getting set up here. All right, now we are ready to go live. All right, cool. Let's get back into the Gladio document. All right, so once again, this is Unholy Alliance by Paul L. Williams. I keep referring to shorthanded as the Gladio book. This next section here is extradition hearing. On September 7th, 1976, the United States, acting on behalf of the Republic of Italy, initiated an extradition proceeding against Sindona in the District Court for the Southern District of New York. Distinguished individuals appeared in court to plead on Sindona's behalf. Carmelo Spagnuolo, president of the Supreme Court in Rome, swore that the charges against Sindona were part of a communist plot to undermine leading industrialists of Italy. He claimed that left-wing extremists within Italy's judiciary had concocted a plot and that Sindona, quote, a great protector of the working class, would be killed as soon as he arrived on Italian soil. Crazy. So yeah, you have like quite literally the right wing firmly in power, the fascists controlling all the institutions, running their blackmail and trafficking schemes, and then insisting that any implication that this is the case, like that the obvious reality in front of your eyes is happening, that's all a communist plot. That's all communist propaganda. Love that. Few in the courtroom were aware that Spagnuolo was a leading member of P2. So again, if you call out like the organization that this man is literally a part of, a leading member of, it was a small wonder, therefore, that the testimony of the Italian judge was supported by Licio Gelli, who, in a signed affidavit to the court, said, quote, "The communists' hatred of Michele Sindona is due to the fact that he is an anti-communist and that he has always been favorable to the free enterprise system in a democratic Italy." Yeah, so all the tired old rhetoric, like the same tried and true, uh, just aphorisms about if you say anything about fascism, if you say anything about the oppressive system you live under, you're just a communist sympathizer. Although Judge Thomas P. Griesa held Sindona extraditable, the Sicilian Don prevailed with an appeal that claimed his case fell within the ambit of Article 6 of the Treaty on Extradition between the United States of America and Italy. And there's some kind of statute listed here 26 UST 493 TIAS 8052. I don't know what that means, which bars extradition. Quote, when the person whose surrender is sought is being proceeded against or had been tried and discharged or punished in the territory of the requested party for the offense for which his extradition is requested. It seems like they're trying to pull like a double jeopardy thing here. By the time the appeal was granted, Sindona was facing similar charges of fraudulent bankruptcy in the United States, creating a situation in which extradition, according to his lawyers, would place him in, quote, double jeopardy. Okay, yeah. So they're just trying to say you can't extradite him for the crime he's already being tried and punished for here in Italy. So therefore, nothing will happen to him at all, I'm guessing. This next section here, there will be blood. While Sindona remained free due to this bizarre interpretation of habeas corpus, the Italian government continued to press for his arrest. This pressure prompted the Pope's banker to initiate action against his adversaries, including Giorgio Ambrosoli, the Italian lawyer who served as the liquidator of Branca Privata Italiana. In 1979, Ambrosoli began to provide damning evidence about Sindona's role in the collapse of Franklin Nation, which might be Franklin National. I thought that was a different thing. Franklin Nation to John Kenney, a prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice. The evidence included transcripts that proved Sindona had pilfered funds from his Italian banks to purchase the shares from Tisch. In addition, Ambrosoli obtained checks and documents from Giorgio Giuliano, deputy superintendent of the Palermo Police Department, which showed that Sindona was laundering heroin profits through the IOR and Amancore, his Swiss bank, for the Gambino Inzerillo Spatola crime syndicate. He also had secured information from Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Varisco, who was investigating P2 concerning Sindona's close relationship with Licio Gelli. On July 11, 1979, only hours after conferring with Kenny, Ambrosoli was shot and killed in Rome after parking his car in front of his apartment. 2 days later, Varisco and his chauffeur were killed by a hitman wielding a sawed-off shotgun. On July 21st, Giorgio Giuliano was shot dead while having a drink at the Lux Bar in Palermo. His replacement at the Palermo Police Department was Giuseppe Impalomeni, a member of the P2. Okay, so like The most blatant acts of just assassinating the people in charge of investigating the wrongdoings of these shadow organizations and then replacing them with people who are in those very shadow organizations. It's like it does not get more obvious. It does not get more blatantly corrupt than that. Just it's pretty mind blowing, you guys. This next section here is the Sicilian coup. While mafia assassins eliminated the problem of his Italian adversaries, Sindona continued to plan a coup that would mark the culmination of the years of lead, the annexation of Sicily from mainland Italy. This plan, initially approved by the Nixon administration in 1972, called for an armed invasion of the island by Gladio units and the installation of a right wing government. Man, that's how little I know about even modern Italian history. I did not know that Sicily was not part of Italy up until the fucking 70s. I had no idea. I'll show my ass. I don't care. I did not know that. It was drafted in response to the anti-American policies of Ugo La Malfa, Minister of the Italian Treasury, and the steady rise of support for the Italian Communist Party in the general elections. John McCaffrey, the Hambros representative in Italy and the chief of the European resistance movement for Europe during World War II, teamed up with Sindona and Graham Martin, the U.S. ambassador to Italy, to become one of the most principal planners of the coup. The coup failed to take place during the Nixon years, according to McCaffrey, because of the quote lack of security for the Gladio units and the quote emergence of the Watergate upheaval. But plans for the coup were revived after Aldo Moro, Italy's prime minister, announced his intent to create a new Italian coalition government of communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats. The notion of such a coalition prompted Sindona to meet with Dr. Joseph Miceli Crimi, the chief surgeon for the Palermo Police Department, a prominent P2 member and a CIA operative, and Rear Admiral Max K. Morris, a prominent naval intelligence official. Admiral Morris advanced the notion of the coup with Admiral Stansfield Turner, the CIA director, and preliminary plans got underway. An American aircraft carrier was deployed off the coast of Sicily with a ship full of soldiers ready to provide military assistance. The ship allegedly was placed under the command of Count Edgardo Sonio, a World War II resistance hero with a long record of involvement in American-backed coup attempts. Okay, so this Count Edgardo Sonio must be like the Smedley Butler of Italy. A similarly funny name too. I've never heard of that guy. Um, but yeah, I also just didn't realize there was a whole Sicilian coup. Like, this is just not something that gets talked about a lot, even in like the Gladio stuff. Like, I had just not remembered this incident. The Admiral, sorry guys, the Admiral's letter is the next section here. Sometime in June 1979, Michele Sindona, Johnny Gambino, and Rosario Spatola met in a room at the Concadoro Motel in Staten Island. Sindona disclosed his plan to liberate Sicily from the mainland. Oh wait, so okay, Sicily was part of Italy, and now they're trying to separate it. That's why I was not understanding. I was like, what the fuck did I miss that Sicily was not part of Italy and became part of it in the 70s? I'm gonna read on. I could just look even stupider if I keep going forward here. He informed them that Dr. Miceli Crimi had generals in the Italian army drawing up maps of the military bases that must be taken over. Quote, the U.S. military has authorized me to do this, he told them. Quote, they will not participate in the coup, but there will be a fleet off the coast of Sicily. After we have taken over, they will enter the island to help restore order and protect us from Italy. For proof of U.S. involvement, Sindona produced a letter from Admiral Morris. Quote, see, it is true, he told the American mobsters. We can do this, but I need 200 more men, more guns. If you help, I will grant all mafiosi amnesty for crimes committed before the coup. So yeah, that's a very attractive offer if you just have like immunity for everything you did up to that point. Rosario Spatola kissed Sindona's hand, a Sicilian gesture of respect. The plan was ingenious. The Gambino capos would cooperate. What greater catastrophe could the combined forces of Gladio, the Mafia, and the Vatican inflict upon Italy for its concessions to communism than the breakaway of one of its most important provinces as a separate state? Okay, so yeah, they're trying to break off Sicily. This next section here is closing time. But it was too late for Sindona to realize his dream of an independent Sicily. In August 1976, Carlo Bordoni, his right-hand man, was arrested in Caracas at the request of the U.S. Justice Department for his role in the collapse of Franklin National. From his cell, Bordoni granted interviews to Italian journalists in which he spoke of the machinations of the Sindona Syndicate, including the ties to the Vatican and the CIA. In January 1977, Mario Barone, whom Sindona appointed to the head of Banca Privata, spoke of the quote, list of 500 that Sindona kept in a safety deposit box. This list, according to Barone, contained the names of 500 politicians, industrialists, and mafiosi involved in Operation Gladio and the smuggling of quote, hot money out of Italy. The walls were closing in on Sindona. The federal officials left Bordoni in the filthy cell in Venezuela 3 years before extraditing him to the United States in June 1979. By this time, Bordoni was willing to spill his guts in court. The trial date for Sindona was set for September 10th, but St. Peter's banker was not terribly worried. He believed he would be protected by the U.S. intelligence officials he had served so long and so well. After all, his only crime was to make the world safe for democracy by, quote, opening the floodgates of black funds. Few men could have done more. On the morning of August 2nd, Sindona walked out of his luxurious suite in the Hotel Pierre and disappeared. No way. Oh, man. So, yeah, I guess the implication there being that he was indeed protected and cared for by those intelligence agents that he served so well, if he can just disappear. Unless you just assume he was taken out. I don't know. What's easier, to give this guy some form of witness protection, or to just kill him? I guess it all depends on what you think these intelligence agencies would do to one of their assets. So, Chapter 10: High Times and New Crimes. Most well-developed heroin networks very quickly moved towards a complementation of interests between the narcotics and traffickers and corrupt elements of the enforcement agencies responsible for the suppression of the illicit drug trade. Alfred McCoy, The Politics of Heroin, in 2003, apparently. Sindona's dream of an independent Sicily was shared by the CIA not only because of its strategic location for U.S. military bases, but also because of the island's pivotal importance to the narcotics industry. By 1970, the Mafia had established hundreds of laboratories within Sicily for the refinement of heroin. One was an orange-roofed stucco villa on the Via Messina Marina. Another was a decrepit storefront near Brancaccio. The Capos no longer needed the services of the Corsicans. They had established their own connections to the drug lords of Southeast Asia and had obtained the services of talented French scientists. To maintain their monopoly on the trade, the Sicilian mob worked with the Nixon administration in launching the so-called War on Drugs. The war resulted in raids by Interpol on Corsican laboratories throughout the French Riviera, eradicating the only source of competition. Business was booming. Okay, so imagine, I know this is like, we've been talking like about an incredible level of corruption involving like the drug enforcement agencies, the intelligence agencies, the governments of various pretty much all Western countries. Um, so to say that they not only created and funded and started the global heroin trade and controlled it, but then they also used the so-called war on drugs to take out any grassroots competitors in that endeavor. Um, should not be too surprising, but still is very funny to think about when people say that like the DEA, like the drug enforcement agencies, are in fact the biggest drug traffickers themselves. This is what people mean when they write books like uh, "The Cartels Do Not Exist." I cannot remember the author's name, but that is a book about this exact kind of thing. By 1971, there were more than 500,000 heroin addicts in the United States, producing a cash flow of $12 billion. On a government survey, 3,054,000 Americans admitted to using heroin at least once. Down at the morgue, where people don't lie, the numbers told a different story. 41% of the drug-related deaths were now linked to heroin. Southeast Asia remained the main source of opium. From Laos alone, over a ton of opium arrived every month in Saigon on C-47 military transport planes that had been provided by the CIA to Lieutenant General Vang Pao of the Royal Lao Army. So much opium was flowing into Saigon that 30% of the American servicemen in Vietnam became heroin addicts. Some of this same heroin was smuggled into the United States in body bags containing dead soldiers. When DEA agent Michael Levine attempted to bust this operation, he was warned off by his superiors, since such action could result in the exposure of the supply line from Long Tien. Cash from the network continued to be deposited by the mob in parochial banks throughout Italy. From these financial firms, including Banco Ambrosiano, the money flowed into the IOR, which continued to collect its 15% processing fee. Before the funds were transferred to privately held mob accounts in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas. But the system was not equipped to handle the billions generated from the heroin trade throughout the world, and so a host of new laundries were established by the CIA. That is an incredible paragraph. Like that whole last paragraph, I'm going to have to definitely cut and post on various social medias because, especially taken with the previous, where you find out that, like, yeah, again, the drug enforcement agencies are in fact the biggest traffickers and purveyors of the drugs themselves. And then you see, like, they're making so much money from doing this that they actually have to come up with more money laundering operations just to hide it all. And they're getting Vietnamese, or like the soldiers in the Vietnam War, addicted to the drugs. Like, and when this is supposedly trying to be investigated, people are shut down in their endeavors trying to do that because it's just too goddamn profitable. Crazy stuff, folks. All right. Castle Bank and Trust. So speaking of these new money laundering operations they have to come up with. Actually, how far am I into this one? Yeah, I'll do 4 more minutes on this one. I'm at 16 minutes so far today. So Castle Bank and Trust. One of the first of these operations was Castle Bank and Trust, which was established in the Cayman Islands by the ubiquitous Paul E. Hellawell in 1962. This bank, according to Penny Lerno, author of In Banks We Trust, quote, formed a bridge between the poppy fields of Thailand and organized crime in the United States. While Hellawell retained his dual role as, quote, CIA paymaster from off the record accounts and mobster's counselor, Hellawell organized an entire Caribbean banking circuit and numerous Panamanian shell companies. He continued to operate Sea Supply and became Thai consul in Miami, operating out of the American Bankers Insurance Building. Ever industrious, Hellawell also served as legal counsel to Meyer Lansky's protege, Santo Trafficante, and as an advisor to Lyndon Johnson. The Cayman Islands presented the ideal place for Hellawell's offshore banking company. A nation of 13,500 residents and 14,000 telex numbers for banks, sometimes no more than tiny offices, the Caymans offered banks a degree of secrecy that matched that of Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein. Within a decade, Castle Bank was joined in the Caymans by a branch of Nugan Hand Bank and the World Finance Corporation. All three dealt with the CIA, the Vatican, and mob boss Santo Trafficante. Crazy. Crazy stuff. Again, another paragraph that if you just like show this to any average American out of context, they would have no idea how to even like wrap their heads around this level of corruption and like just uh deep operations of a separate state that actually controls the state that you know of. This next section here is the CIA casino. Initially, the funding for the Castle Bank came from the International Diversified Corporation, a CIA-controlled Panamanian holding company that had been set up by the CIA operative Wallace Groves. A convicted felon who had served 2 years in prison for selling worthless stock, the agency had assigned Groves such tasks as organizing coups, funding political parties, and cleaning dirty money. Okay, so it's like very much a catch me if you can scenario where they got this guy who's so good at doing all these scams and con artistry that they were like they just recruit him. They just get him to do that same thing for them. Money flowed into the Castle Bank not only from International Diversified, but also from a host of underworld figures, including Mo Dalitz, the racketeer who became known as quote Mr. Las Vegas, and and Morris Kleinman and Samuel A. Tucker, who operated the gambling syndicate in Ohio and the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. There's a gambling syndicate in Ohio, apparently. I guess that's what they're talking about when they have the Midwest Bob Mosses. It's something that is like a recurring trope in like gangster movies and things like that. So this next section here is a sinister sister. Castle Bank and Trust was joined at the hip to Mercantile Bank and Trust, another CIA operation that was set up in the Bahamas by Hellawell. Castle owned a large bank of stock in Mercantile and vice versa, and both became principal depositors in each other's operation. In addition, the banks shared most of the same directors. Money flowed back and forth in a bewildering array of transactions that included international diversified. Mercantile and Castle interlocked with Underwriters Bank Limited, another firm that Hellwell created in the Bahamas. The majority shareholder of this firm was the American insurance conglomerate American International Underwriters Corp. AIUC, which was established as a part of the insurance empire headed by former OSS agent C.V. Starr, and evolved into the giant multinational AIG, American International Group. AIUC, according to Peter Dale Scott, author of The American War Machine, quote, was an insurance conglomerate with suspected ties to the CIA in Southeast Asia. In 1976, Mercantile was closed by the Bahamian government after investors discovered that the bank's holdings were worthless. This came as a surprise to the shareholders since Peter Waterhouse, the prestigious accounting firm, had certified a few months before the collapse that Mercantile possessed $25.1 billion dollars in assets. Unfortunately, these assets were alleged, quote, loans given to unidentified individuals. The money vanished into the agency's, quote, black hole. So I think I'll bookmark it here because I'm probably at about 20 minutes for this book. Yeah. And then we'll pick up tomorrow on the next session called The Black Hole. So I think that's a cool uh, function of capitalism is that you have these guys whose entire career and it actually ends up holding up a significant portion of the economy is to create fictional financial instruments to move money around, to create businesses over and over again in places where, white people have colonized a bunch of people of color, uh, create a whole bunch of just legal fictions in order to move money around that you are also getting from your drug trade, your illegal drug trade that you use to impoverish people, and then the money you use to put down workers' movements to assassinate anyone who stands up for any kind of like working class group of any kind, to overthrow governments. That's so cool. This is all a great function of capitalism, proving that it works very well. So now we'll move on to Western Marxism. So we're on to section 15 here, the isolation of Lukács. When he analyzed nation and race, Timpanaro found himself in a dilemma without an escape. Either the nation is biological, as theorists of biological racism maintain, or, once we have put aside this ominous vision, there is only the inconsistency of the nation itself. In either case, there was no place for the national or colonial question. With the later Lukács, we can say, quote, either social being is not distinct from being in general, or else it is seen as something radically different without having any longer at all the character of being. We have arrived at the Western philosopher who, together with Gramsci, most intensely identified with Lenin. His early great text, History and Class Consciousness, did not pay much attention to the colonial and national questions. And even in his more mature works, it is curious that the historical account of the period from 1789 to 1814, from the overthrow of the Ancien regime to the Restoration, lacks any reference to the abolition of black slavery in the colonies, the work of Toussaint Louverture and Robespierre, or of its reintroduction by Napoleon. Hmm. So he's talking about, I'm actually not clear if he's talking about Lukács or Timpanaro here. I think he's talking about Lukács, right? However, it is a great relief that in his 1924 book dedicated to Lenin, he analyzes with precision the revolutionary role of, quote, the nations oppressed and exploited by capitalism. Their struggle was an integral part of the world revolutionary process. He harshly criticizes those who, searching for a, quote, purely proletarian revolution, neglect the colonial and national question and end up losing sight of the concrete revolutionary process. Thanks to the attention paid to colonialism and its intrinsic barbarism, the Hungarian philosopher was far from the idealist transfiguration of the liberal West, of which Bloch, Horkheimer, and Adorno repeatedly wrote. He called attention to Marx's denunciation of the quote, enslavement of Ireland by the British Empire and lamented that this denunciation had found little echo in the quote, contemporary English labor movement and the Second International. Unfortunately, we must add that even the thesis that Lukács derives from Lenin of the centrality of the colonial and national question in the context of the world revolutionary process found little echo in Western Marxism. Yep. I love that idea of like just transcending nationalism, like saying that you have to transcend the idea of the nation state, saying that they are invalid, but then also in practice, in every possible instance, siding with the Western imperialist powers when it comes to policies like actual government actions or military actions done on behalf or in the interest of nation states. It's a weird tenet of Western Marxism that keeps cropping up over and over again. Despite being characterized by various positions, ranging from a committed anti-colonialism but an often fragile theoretical platform to a declared pro-colonialism, on the whole, Western Marxism missed the meeting with the world anti-colonialist revolution. Yeah, that's a much better way of summing that up. Part 4: The Triumph and Death of Western Marxism. So, Section 1: Ex Occidente Lux et Salus, Light and Salvation from the West. We can now better understand the manifesto with which Perry Anderson in 1976 proclaimed the excellence of a Western Marxism that had finally rid itself of every connection to the Eastern version. It was the year of Mao's death. Following this event came a test of strength between aspirants of, or potential heirs, with the rise to power of a leadership group that quickly ended the quote cultural revolution. However, the tension between China and the Soviet Union remained high. Not only the socialist camp, but also the anti-colonialist camp was filled with contradictions of an era of crisis. Sorry, contradictions and an era of crisis. In Europe, quote, Euro-communism affirmed itself by distancing itself from actually existing socialism, which was entirely located in the East, gathering up the most important communist parties of Western Europe, those of Italy, France, and Spain. Even on the left, the religion of the West proliferated, ex occidente lux et salus. And so a tendency that had manifested itself immediately after the October Revolution reached maturity. While the civil war still raged in Russia, the Italian reformist leader Filippo Turati scolded the followers of Bolshevism for having lost sight of, quote, our great superiority of civil evolution from a historical point of view, and of having abandoned themselves and having abandoned themselves therefore to, quote, infatuation for the Eastern world ahead of the Western world and Europe. They forgot that the Russian Soviets were to the Western, quote, parliaments as the barbaric horde was to the city. Uh, not sure exactly what he means by that. It just sounds like Russophobic. Like it sounds like that common thing that people do. It sounds like it's all just based in this like weird version of racism that people don't recognize as racism, either because people in like the continent of Asia have like a light enough skin tone that people don't recognize it as like the very obvious anti people of color racism, like against brown and black people. Like that's just more obvious. But this is another just common and constant theme that we're seeing. It's like um, it's why the last book that I'm going to do after this one, the Soviets expected it. It's great. Like shout out to Shubels for suggesting it because he had said in the comments before, like it humanizes the Russian people in a way that we often do not get in Western propaganda, and it's wild how like just how quickly everyone took to like calling Russian people orcs, uh, just like siding with literal neo Nazis because they think Russia is just that scary, or Putin himself is that scary, and they're willing to write off like millions of people because of their personal infatuation with this figure of Putin. Um, yeah, it's bad. It's really embarrassing, and it's like yeah, a huge tendency in Western Marxism, unfortunately. Let's see. The first of the two essays by the reformist leader I cited was contrasted in its title, quote, Leninism and Marxism. Leninism was synonymous with Eastern Marxism, crude and barbaric by definition, while Marxism was synonymous with Western Marxism, civil, fine, and authentic, again by definition. This Orientalist reading of the social, political, and cultural reality of Soviet Russia was widespread in the West. Yeah, I could have just summed up that whole rant I went on by saying Orientalism. Even before Tarati, while the war was still ongoing, Bloch declared of Soviet Russia, quote, nothing comes of it but stink and barbarism, or in other words, a new Genghis Khan, which poses as the liberator of the people and abusively waves the emblems of socialism. Oh my God. So they've been saying this no matter who is in charge of Russia, no matter who is in charge of the Soviet Union, no matter who is in charge of that territory that everyone is scared of. They will call them Genghis Khan. They will call them some kind of like Putler figure. They will equate them with fascism and totalitarianism. They will equate them with anything else to make whatever dishonest criticism they want to make. That's crazy. I'm gonna have to save that paragraph too. That's great. And yet, this was the same philosopher who called attention to the dramatic nature of the situation in the country of the October Revolution, criticizing the Bolsheviks for being guilty, in Bloch's eyes, of having refused to continue to fight alongside or at the service of France, Great Britain, and the United States. One important point remained. The Germany of Wilhelm II had invaded Russia, annexed vast areas, and was responsible for colonial style massacres. Recognition of the tragic state of exception did not affect Orientalist readings of the revolution and Bolshevik power. A decade later, Kautsky lamented, quote, Russia's cities are still saturated with Oriental essence. Oof. So yeah, it's just blatant Orientalism. There was some truth to these arguments. The country of the October Revolution did not have a history of constitutionalism. Ignored or erased, however, was the support provided by the liberal West, first for the Tsarist autocracy, and then for the bands of whites that sought to bring this autocracy back or to install a military dictatorship. Nor was any reference made to the highly precarious geopolitical situation that the country of the October Revolution found itself in, nor to the permanent state of exception imposed on it by this condition and by the power of the liberal West. Again, yeah, like equating anything that uh, Russia or the Soviets did with what was being done to them by external forces. It always creates this like starting point of sympathy for the West that people won't even acknowledge when they're doing it. When they're civils. Sorry, I blocked this bot here, folks. So Bloch did not consider a basic contradiction. He demanded liberal and parliamentary development of the regime born of the October Revolution. But he supported the continuation of the war that, because of its intrinsic brutality and barbarism, and because of the great majority of the population opposed it, could be conducted only by merciless dictatorial methods. As far as Kautsky was concerned, it was no accident that he turned to, quote, Oriental essence rather than history and geography. Mhm. Yeah, when you can't argue with facts, just start resorting to these weird, uh, I don't know, woo-woo attacks of like it's like spiritual stuff. That's why like there's so much propaganda nowadays to support any kind of Western propaganda that literally just relies on spiritual bullshit. It's like woo-woo bullshit. They don't have the facts on their side anymore. Like it's not the early '90s. You can't pretend that America is like the best country in the world and is even like when people fail that, like when people fail to like pretend that the West or the US is like objectively better or morally right in any way, then they just resort to, oh, well, we're still going to just live high on the hog, even on our indecency. And they can't even like ride on that anymore. So now it's just all cope. It was an essentialist approach that persisted over time. Still in 1968, while the war unleashed in Vietnam by the United States revealed itself in all its horror, rather than indignation over U.S. and Western cruelty, Horkheimer explained Stalin and Mao and the quote totalitarian apparatus they put in place as the result of quote the collective cruelty practiced in the East. Hmm. Yeah, don't look at the Vietnam War and the like quite literal uh, war crimes and atrocities committed. Just listen to what we're saying is happening over in the East, and believe me, that's definitely happening. In that same year, despite recognizing, as we know, quote, the immense aggressive force of capitalism imperialism that forced countries targeted by it to, quote, desperately defend themselves, Marcuse spoke of Eastern totalitarianism, with recourse to a category that tended toward essentialism. Without making any reference to the difficult geopolitical situation of the Soviet Union or of China, and ignoring the theoretical limits of Marx, a Western philosopher little interested in the problem of the limitation of power because, at times, he was prone to the messianic expectation of the extinction of the state and power as such. The category of, quote, Eastern totalitarianism attributed the lack of democratic development of those countries entirely to a mythic Orient. Mhm. Yeah, it's not because they're dealing with like a quite literal totalitarian empire that is trying at every moment and on every possible front to subvert, um, dismantle, uh, like de-develop your country and your project of anti-imperialism. It's that you just have some kind of weird mythical uh, racial character to your entire people that prevents you from having the democracy that those people would like to see you have. You know. Western Marxism continued to the end to show the influence of the ideology of the Cold War. George F. Kennan, the great U.S. theorist of the policy of quote containment, also argued that it was necessary to keep under control the quote Oriental mind. Indeed, in Western Marxism, the Orientalist approach survived the Cold War. We have seen Zizek paint Mao Zedong as a despot so ferocious and capriciously bloody as to make us think of the most grotesque Orientalist stereotypes. Situated in this context, the success of Anderson's book was anything but surprising. Abandoning their fate to abandoning their fate, abandoning to their fate Eastern Marxism and the countries inspired by it, Western Marxism would be rid of something that had clipped its wings and prevented it from flying high. In reality, the success and even the triumph that Western Marxism and Euro communism enjoyed would be revealed to be short-lived. The times rapidly brought about the death of both. Yeah, like what is the success of Euro communism? Is this just the Scandinavian model they're talking about, like European like reformist social democracies that are themselves still based on imperialism, and then also lose those benefits whenever times get tough, like whenever the imperialism starts to get a little harder to maintain, whether the capitalists start squeezing their grip on those social benefits they benevolently gave you. Uh, Wild. Shibble says, "Imagine how good a place is that they kick you out and you still write as a bomb ass book praising the principles of the USSR." Yeah, referring to Anna Louise Strong. Wonder if is it time to switch over to that one? No, 5 more minutes on this book, and then we'll switch over to that one. So this next section, section two, the cult of Arendt and the erasure of the colonialism Nazism nexus. For some time, the disdainful refusal to understand what was happening in the East with the anti colonial revolution and post capitalism had prepared the terrain for ideological capitulation. This brings to mind the cult devoted at a certain point to a philosopher who, having moved away from positions of the extreme left, ended up defining Marx as an enemy of freedom who inspired totalitarian communism. I refer to Hannah Arendt, who in our own times has been somewhat adventurously compared to Rosa Luxemburg and is one of the authors cited in Empire, a book that has been a major media success of Western Marxism. Already faint, the bonds linking Western Marxism to the world anti colonialist revolution here break apart. The colonial peoples and those of colonial origin in the struggle for emancipation had long been aware of the close relationship between Nazism and and the colonialist tradition. 1 year after the rise of the Third Reich, W.E.B. Du Bois compared the racial state that Hitler was building in Germany to the one that had long been in effect in the U.S. South, and to the regime of white supremacy and colonial and racial domination that the entire West had created across the entire world. I mean, a very apt comparison. It's like pretty fucking obvious unless you are like one of the beneficiaries of that system and therefore have to pull the wool over your own eyes to ignore it. Writing his autobiography some years later, the African American author repeated the essential point. Quote, Hitler is the late crude but logical exponent of the white world race philosophy. Therefore, the democratic United States and the West in general had no credibility, founded as they were on the exclusion of the quote inferior classes, and above all, the quote colored peoples of Asia and Africa. Significantly, the nexus between the Third Reich and the colonialist tradition was sometimes made evident by using the category totalitarianism. In 1942 to 43, while distancing himself from the violent methods that the communist movement was criticized for, an African American militant of the extreme left, A. Philip Randolph, made clear an essential point. In speaking about Nazi Germany, the colonialist and racial empire that Japan sought to impose on China, that which Great Britain maintained in India, and about the white supremacist regime of the US South, one could speak of, quote, Hitlerism, of racism, but also of totalitarian tyranny. The international situation was characterized by the struggle of the quote, colored races against the various imperialisms and the different forms of racism and totalitarian tyranny. Totalitarianism was the power exercised by the so-called superior races over the peoples of color the peoples of color of the colonial world. Yeah, I mean, it's all just to say that like whatever gestures the US or the West make at democracy, at bringing about freedom, have always been this hollow, have always been this just hypocritical. And when people call it out, they are ignored and they are shut down. And then people like Hannah Arendt are given the platform. That's why you see like white Western leftists constantly referring to Arendt to defend their neoliberal bullshit. In taking this position, Randolph referred to Gandhi, leader of the independence movement, who in an April 1941 interview declared, quote, I assert that in India we have Hitlerian rule, however disguised it may be, in softer terms. This method of argument was wrong to not provide the needed nuance regarding the existing differences between the political realities being compared, but was right to make clear their common traits. The idea of racial hierarchy, the idea that the quote racially inferior peoples were destined by nature and by providence to undergo the domination of the white or Aryan race. This set of ideas led Hitler to build the quote German Indies on the model of the British Indies, or seek in Eastern Europe the Wild West or frontier to subject and colonize following the US model. After the end of the Second World War, the view that linked the regime of white supremacy, sorry, the the regime of white supremacy still in power in the U.S. South to the Third Reich was widespread among African Americans. One episode that happened in those years in New York speaks eloquently to this. An episode that, though she did not understand its full meaning, Hannah Arendt referred to in a January 1960 letter to Carl Jaspers. Quote, the high schools of New York gave all the students of the senior classes the assignment of thinking up an appropriate punishment for Hitler. A Negro girl wrote, quote, he should have black skin put on him and be forced to live in the United States. In a fresh and ingenuous way, the candid black girl imagined a sort of law of retaliation, in which those responsible for the racist violence of Nazi Germany would be forced to undergo as blacks the humiliations and bullying of the regime of white supremacy that they had untiringly propagandized for and carried out mercilessly. Yeah, it's not like Hannah Arendt was an enemy of like the US. Like, there's a reason. Again, she gets quoted in all the Western compatible left circles. Let me see. Oh yeah, I'm at 40 minutes here, so I'm going to switch over to the third book. So I will bookmark this one here. Yeah, I don't know anyone who's not just a flat out neoliberal who takes Hannah Arendt seriously. So now we are going to switch over to The Soviets Expected It by Louise Strong. Close it out for the day. Okay, so continuing here, I think the Russians have a better slant. Let's see, make this a little bigger for my old eyes. She says, I think the Russians have a better slant. It may be propaganda, but it's pretty good propaganda when the Russians at the front report that what surprises them most is the lack of individual initiative shown by the German superior race. They say that when the German officers are killed, the rank and file shout for somebody to come give them orders. When Germans are captured, they do not seem to know what they are fighting for. One of the best anecdotes is that of a German corporal from Breslau, who, when questioned by a Soviet reporter, said he didn't know why the Germans had attacked the USSR. Don't you read the newspapers? Asked the Red Army inquirer. No, I fulfill the orders of my superior, said the man with the Nazi soul. Are you a human being or a machine? Persisted the Red Army representative. The corporal stared for a moment at the unexpected question and then answered sullenly, we are all of us machines. I don't know whether he meant to refer to the German army, or expressed the wider philosophy that all men are puppets of fate. But I know those words would shock all Soviet people as the ultimate sacrilege, as the symbol of the slavery against which they war. Russians know they are not machines. Russians know they are people, people who can make and break machines. Wouldn't that be like a nice thing for people to believe here in the West? Like, people are so scared of like machines taking over, and they feel so resigned to it. Like, they just feel like it's totally inevitable. They're not even. They call you like a dreamer if you act like that's a bad thing that should not happen, and you think that like people should maybe prevent that. Section two or chapter two, something to fight for. The first thing that surprised and impressed Americans as the Soviets entered the war was what Ben Hecht of PM called the legend-making courage of the Red Army and even of the civilian population. He added, quote, in their great battles, one felt not only the resistance of a strong-souled people to a conqueror, but their love for the thing they are defending. Other correspondents made similar comments. It had been fairly widely believed in America that Soviet peasants would not, quote, die for Stalin, but would seize the chance to overthrow a hated regime. At the very least, they would remain passive under the change of masters in the traditional peasant way. The world was therefore amazed when all over the invaded districts, Soviet farmers destroyed their own homes to prevent the Germans from using them, and then formed guerrilla bands. They seemed almost like suicide squads to harry the invader. Almost every news commentator immediately made the comparison with France. Quote, the French army was hailed as the best in the world, said the Washington merry-go-round, yet it collapsed in 11 short days. More important than Hitler's panzer divisions, more important than Stuka dive bombers, was the fact that French troops did not want to fight. Crazy. Not doing a lot for the stereotype of French soldiers being cowards and who surrender. Men in the trenches had no idea why they were fighting. If they knew anything, it was that they were fighting for the Comité de Forge, Steel Trust, or the 200 families that ruled the Bank of France. So France fell. 1 year later, an entirely different story comes from Russia. Obviously, Russian troops are defending something which they cherish. They had what the French lacked morale. An ingenious explanation of why Soviet farmers willingly put the torch of destruction to their homes was proposed by a New York radio commentator. He said it was due to communism, that the peasants did not so much mind destroying things that belonged to the government. He contrasted certain French villages whose mayors actually asked the French soldiers defending them to surrender to the Germans, lest the battle come into the streets of the village and destroy their homes. Their little houses meant so much to the quote French peasants' sense of private property, and they felt that one small village would not matter so much to France. This explanation is a rather startling commentary on what the sense of private property does to the chances of a nation's survival in modern war. But it hardly explains how the Soviet farmer, after destroying his house, should battle so bravely for the empty government owned fields. The commentator, moreover, knows very little about the Soviet Union's property laws. The house the peasant destroys is really his own. He built it, he paid for it, and his ownership and right to leave it to his family are guaranteed by the Soviet Constitution, which protects as quote personal property all goods of consumption, including small houses and all personally used tools. The peasant destroys his house, which he built with much labor, in order to protect a property that is much more valuable to him, his share in the publicly owned wealth. And that's very similar to like what you hear now. Like people love to pretend that Chinese people don't actually own their homes or the land that it's on because they talk about like the 75-year lease, but they don't talk about any of the other rules regarding that lease, how you automatically get it back. It's like 1% of the value that you pay once every 75 years instead of like the I don't even know what property taxes typically are in the US. It varies so much from state to state, even localities within states. Like people literally move around because of where the property taxes are high or low. That's how onerous they are here. And they have the gall to act like China, where 95% of people own their homes. Yeah, they act like that's the totalitarian regime or that it's worse somehow. People are so fucking propagandized. It's really sad. Like I would feel bad for Americans if they also weren't the absolute worst people in the world. Pretty sick of the bots. You guys are getting really fucking annoying. Shibble says pacifism is the characteristic of liberalism. It's Mao from combat liberalism. Yeah. The first mighty stimulus to the Soviet people's courageous fighting is the public ownership of all the vast resources of one-sixth of the world. The Soviet people are defending their property, and it is by far the most valuable chunk of property under one ownership anywhere in the world. The natural, sorry, there's some kind of like footnote here. I was going to skip over. It's like talking about the Constitution of the USSR. The natural resources, the mines, power plants, factories of the whole USSR are the joint property around which the joint owners rally as one united fist. So I'll go back and I'll check out this footnote. Let's see. So Constitution of the USSR adopted December 5th, 1936. Article 6, the land, its deposits, waters, forests, mills, factories, mines, railway, water and air transport, banks, means of communication, large state organized farm enterprises, state farms, machine tractor stations, etc., and also the basic housing facilities in cities and industrial localities are state property. That is, the wealth of the whole people. Article 10, the right of personal property of citizens in their income from work and in their savings, in their dwelling house and auxiliary husbandry, in household articles and utensils, and in articles for personal use and comfort, as well as the right of inheritance of personal property of citizens, is protected by law. So, yeah, not contradictory, just a simple definition of public versus private property. Let's see. Joint ownership of the nation's resources is no romantic slogan. In very concrete ways, each Soviet citizen knows that he shares the national wealth. That peasant putting his torch to his cottage knows that his home is covered by state fire insurance and that if he burns it down in obedience to a national policy, the rebuilding of his home will be a first charge on the whole national resources at the end of the war. Those collective farmers who destroy their precious machinery, for which they perhaps paid by going half fed and half clad for years, know very well that as soon as they win the war, the Soviet farm implement plants will all work overtime to send the very newest machinery to their farms. This is a very simple and practical reason why the hard headed peasants will first destroy their own villages and then fight like demons to drive the German armies out of all the Soviet fields. Which is also crazy. It reminds me of when I talked about in South Africa. like the way that boar farmers were fighting, and not to like give too much credit to like the also white colonizers, but like the reason that the English or the Dutch or whoever, yeah, I guess it was the Dutch who, God, I can't remember from my own fucking podcast. Was it English or Dutch who were like using concentration camps? I guess it was English people, maybe. I don't know. It doesn't fucking matter. They invented concentration camps to keep these boer farmer families in. It wasn't even the boer farmers themselves. These people um, either had their farms taken from them or destroyed. They went and became guerrillas. They lived in the fucking jungle, and they would attack these colonizers, these other colonizers, and then because they were doing so well at it, they had to kidnap those guerrillas' families and keep them in the concentration camps. This is mostly women and children who were kept there. And remember, they also had separate concentration camps for their servants of color because still racist. Um, but yeah, that's what happens. Like if you have people who just surrender because they care so much about the private property, like literally the brick and mortar buildings, that they will just surrender their whole country. That's what you have in like France, and then you have people like the Soviets who are like, "No, we know we can rebuild that stuff. We care about the land. We actually understand the means of production. We're going to destroy the machines rather than let the Germans take them." Like all of this makes so much more sense once you actually have a historical materialist interpretation of things, even of the present. It doesn't even have to be like historical. Division of property leads to division of interest. Since the dawn of history, this division has injured morale in every war. Never, probably, has there been a fully united nation. The American War of Independence and the Civil War were notorious for disloyalties of Tories and Copperheads caused by divergent property rights. The present World War shows far more spectacular examples, the most striking of which is the betrayal of France by her men of property and their supporters. But even in Britain, the fact that the government leased the privately owned railways at a sum which gave the stockholders greater dividends than in time of peace, that land for air raid shelters had to be secured from private owners, that tenants on long term leases continued to pay rent on houses that had been destroyed by bombs. All these things are sources of frictions and difficult adjustments that are bad for national morale. Even though such questions are eventually regulated in a sound country under the war pressure, the sacrifices of different classes remain unequal. The men who own the properties are not identical with the men who are called to fight for their protection. Damn, ain't that the truth? Don't people realize that over and over in songs and memes for decades, but do nothing about it? Don't they keep saying that shit over and over again and not do a fucking thing to overturn that system? A country that can blow up a Dnieper dam, one of the one of the world's great properties, by a single order and without a qualm from any private property owner, has a source of national morale and even of military efficiency denied to nations that leave factories and even bridges intact because of local interests. The suspicion in Britain, even if no more than suspicion, that the Royal Air Force refrained from molesting Romanian oil fields from Greece because the fields belonged to British owners injures national morale at its foundations. Yeah, I mean that literally creates the hotbed, like the growing ground, like the fertile ground for conspiracy theories. When people say like, "Oh, it's actually the financiers who control the war interests," because look, we leave their assets alone, and then we send a bunch of our family and friends to die for those same interests. It obviously like people can see the reality in front of their eyes, but then when they have to insert nationality and spiritual bullshit on top of it, yeah, then they end up with fascism. You end up with stupid shit as opposed to actually understanding the material reality you live in. Aside from morale, public ownership of the basic large properties unquestionably makes possible a more efficient handling of the country's resources in an all-out war. When war began in London, the air raid wardens had first to be appointed and then get acquainted with their districts and begin to iron out the countless problems of mutual adjustment. In Moscow, all the large buildings in the center of the city, though not all small houses in the suburbs, belong to the municipality. Every big apartment house has long had its house committee, elected by the inhabitants and directly responsible to the city. These committees years ago listed the capacities and interests of every inhabitant in order to furnish them with playground facilities, classes for housemaids, and possibly a common laundry or reading room. When war begins, the whole organization for civil defense is already there in the House committees, which almost automatically appoint night watchers, young men to guard the roofs from incendiary bombs, and gangs of able bodied inhabitants to dig shelters in the courtyard or to fortify the basement according to whatever plan the city engineers approve. It's crazy. It's almost like when you have government that works for the people, those people are also then incentivized to take the initiative and make that government work in its own interest to maintain itself rather than just abandoning it at the first opportunity. It's almost like the same uh, totalitarian impulse that they're projecting onto the Soviets is actually true of the Western quote unquote democracy. And the eagerness to abandon that is actually true of the Western citizens. Yeah. Shibboleth reminds me Dutch, then British for Congo colonization. Thank you. I thought it was like Dutch and then British. Or didn't I? I don't know. I can't remember. It took many years for the sense of joint ownership of the public properties to come to the full development that exists today. The earlier attitude towards public property was sometimes, as it too often is in America and Britain, that what belongs to the that what belongs to the public may be wasted, since it doesn't belong to me. I imagine, however, that our Tennessee Valley quote peasants would fight fully as hard to defend the publicly owned dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority as they would for their own small homes. Well, I don't know anymore. I wonder if people still have that kind of connection or even realization of how important those things are. Efforts both of Soviet educators and of Soviet criminal courts during that early period were devoted to creating a sense of responsibility toward the public wealth. Some of the penalties imposed rather startled the world. A man who committed a quote private murder might get only a few years jail sentence, while a high official who grafted seriously on the public wealth or wrecked public properties might be sentenced to death. In the Soviet view, the latter offense was really more serious to the interests of society. Yeah, I mean, it literally is just like the trolley problem, right? Like if you're hurting one person as opposed to many people, it's just that when you have capitalism involved and you like inherently value rich people as more valuable than others, that all gets toppled. It all gets flipped on its head. As a new generation grew up under Soviet conditions, the sense of joint ownership of vast resources began to infect them with a tremendous sense of power. It was often extravagantly expressed. Quote, "We young owners of our country called upon to conquer space and time," said Anna Mlanek, valedictorian some years ago of her class in a Moscow school. Quote, "I can fly to the moon, go to the Arctic, make a new discovery," exulted the writer Avdayenko. Quote, "For my creative energy is not trod on by anyone." Some latitude of romantic expression must be allowed to writers and valedictorians, but their comments hardly took this form in other lands of Europe during those years. That also sounds like that's how optimistic people were. Like again, only '90s kids will remember, but in the '90s in the US, that was the sense of optimism that people had. Like the Soviet Union had fallen. It looked like there was just going to be this unending ascendance of capitalism and liberalism that was going to solve everyone's problems now that that was the one world system. And it was only these weird fringe anti-globalist people, a term that hadn't yet been invented, uh, who thought that there was any kind of like nefarious undertones to any of that. Um, and now we see, just 30 years later, the the abject failure of capitalism and the rise again of communism. This enthusiasm indicates the second great source of the Soviet fighting morale. It is that they are fighting for quote their freedom, not a formal negative freedom based upon absence of interference, but a dynamic and collectively reinforced freedom based upon equal access to all the great resources of their land. It is almost pathetic today to note how often the Soviet press repeats the words, quote, all freedom loving peoples. They are trying, across the barriers of long misrepresentation, of which they are very conscious, to assure the people of the Western democracies that Soviet people are freedom loving too. The most dangerous propaganda lie of our decade has been the constant and deliberate coupling of the USSR with the Nazis under the word communazi, or even the word totalitarian, a phrase which most Soviet people have never heard. Again, this ties in perfectly with the Western Marxism book. We were just reading about the origins of this term totalitarianism and how it was specifically created and fomented by people like Arendt and the Western quote unquote democracies to equate communism with fascism. It's literally just horseshoe theory bullshit. It has been repeated so often that possibly most Americans think that the Soviet people, or at least their theoreticians, consciously denounce democracy as the Nazis do. On the contrary, they have always consciously claimed it. Lenin's phrase was, quote, Soviet power is a million times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. Their criticism of America and Britain has never been the Nazi sneer at effete democracy. The Soviet people have criticized us for not being democratic enough, since we cannot control through our government as they do the productive mechanism which dominates our lives. Yeah. That is like the perfect encapsulation of exactly the hypocrisy of the horseshoe theory bullshit. So I'm pretty sure I'm at an hour for the day. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Uh, Thank you once again for joining me, folks. I really appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoy uh, me reading through these things and then providing some bit of like commentary, as dumb as it is, when I forget even some of my own material from recent episodes. But I don't know, I find all this stuff endlessly interesting, and I hope people start to understand just how propagandized people here in the West are